How do you report hypothesis test results in APA format? So remember that hypothesis testing has 4 steps. 1, you're going to have your hypotheses, you're going to pick your test, you're going to compute a test statistic and p-value, and you're going to summarize your results. So 4-step process. Of these, the first 3 do not appear anywhere in the literature. The only thing you see is step number 4. And it's presented in this way by stating the test statistic, the degrees of freedom, the p-value, and sometimes something reported called the effect size. Now, we're not going to get into effect size in this session. We're going to talk about effect size in our next session together. Often, a figure or a table is used to summarize means and standard deviations and standard errors that were measured in the study. So, for example, a social psychologist records the number of outbursts in a sample of different classrooms at a local school. Based on the statement below, what are the sample size and what was the decision to reject or to fail to reject the null hypothesis? So here is what you would see reported in the literature, just this one line. The number of outbursts among students at this local school, M equals 3, was significantly less than that of the general population. T parentheses 39 equals 4.19, P is less than 0.05, D equals 0.25. Okay, so there's a lot packed in there, so let's unpack it for a moment. So let's talk first of all about the sample size. Now, this right here is the degrees of freedom. And remember, the degrees of freedom is a sample size minus 1. So if the degrees of freedom is 39, we know that the sample size, n, was 40. Now let's talk about the decision, right? It says the number of outbursts among students at this local school was significantly less. So the null hypothesis had to have been the mean is equal to some number that we don't know, but the alternative was that the mean was less than that number, whatever that number was. So we can see here that the mean that's reported from the sample was 3. So the number of outbursts among students at this local school, mean equals 3, was significantly less than the general population. In other words, the null hypothesis was rejected. We also know that because the p-value is small. The specific p-value is not reported, but we are told that it's less than 0.05, so it was less than the significance level. So we know that behind the scenes, again, none of this was visible to us, only this one line, but behind the scenes we got a p-value that was less than 0.05, causing us to reject the null hypothesis and come to this conclusion. Okay? So let's take a look at if we were going to write the results of example 1 or 2, or let's see, maybe we'll do both in APA format. So let's take a look at example 1. Okay, so in example 1, let's just record some of the information in this problem. In example 1, our sample mean was 14.3. And our conclusion was that the number of mean years of experience at this hospital had increased. And this was based on a sample size of 35. And our test statistic, we were told, was 2.17. And we had a very small p-value, which led us to reject the null hypothesis. So let's see if we can use this APA format here and this example here and write that conclusion for example number 1. So we might start off by saying something like, the mean years of experience of the nursing staff at this hospital and let's report their mean experience. So their mean is equal to 14.3. was significantly greater than in previous years. And now we'll give more information. We did a t-test. Now remember, our sample size was 35, so the number of degrees of freedom would be 34. So t parentheses 34. Our test statistic was 2.17. Our p-value was less than 0.05. And that's how we could report the results of example 1 in APA format. In example 2, this was about the number of hours in social media. So let's record what we had here. We had a sample mean of 1.6 hours and a sample size of 15. Our test statistic was negative 1.10, and our p-value was 0.29. And what we concluded was there was no evidence that the new parents' time on social media differed from 2 hours. All right, so how might that look in APA format? We're going to write our conclusion. So the mean hours spent by new parents on social media did not differ significantly from the general population. And now we'll give all of those details asked for in APA format. So we would say we used a t-test. The degrees of freedom was 14 because our sample size was 15. And the test statistic for that problem was negative 1.10. And our p-value is greater than 0.05. So that's how that one might be reported using APA format. So in general, when we're doing problems involving population means, the tests we're using are called t-tests. And while we just did one type in our examples, there are actually 3 kinds. And we're going to take a look at the other kinds in an upcoming lecture, I think in 2 class sessions. So the one we did in this class session was a 1 sample t-test. It compares a sample mean with some known population mean. So for example, I have a sample of nurses' experience, and how does that compare to this national average? I have 1 sample of new parents of newborns, and how does that 1 sample compare to the national average? Those 1 sample t-tests are not seen very often in research, but we had to start there because it's the simplest kind of t-test there is. More often, you see t-tests from 2 independent samples, which compares the means of 2 independent samples. So for example, they mean anxiety levels of students in an online program versus students in a face-to-face program. You have a group of students in one version of a class, group of students in another version of instruction, and you're going to compare their anxiety levels. The mean income of graduates from public institutions versus the mean income of graduates from private institutions. So that would be independent samples. And again, we're going to take a look at that in a few classes. And finally, there's a t-test for dependent samples. So in that model, each subject that you have in your study gives you 2 pieces of data. More often than not, it's pre-post data or before and after data. So there's 3 different kinds of t-tests. So here's a picture of a table from a research article. I included the citation in case you wanted to look it up. But you can see, like we said, often the means and standard deviations are reported in a table form. So here, they give you the mean and in parentheses, they give you the standard deviation. And here they give you the test statistic. And here they have a number here called G effect size, which we're going to talk about in our next lecture together. But for example, you can see that this is a very large test statistic. Remember, if you think about test statistics being z-score, that's like a z-score or a t-score of -8. Remember that anything greater than 2 is pretty unusual. So to be greater than 8 or less than -8, highly unusual. And so these two test statistics are very unusual. And then what you see here is a little asterisk. And so what the asterisk means is your p-value is small. What they're reporting is your p-value is less than 0.002. So for these two criteria on the table, significant differences were found between the groups, two groups. And I think we're going to stop it there. There are two kinds of potential errors, but we're going to be talking more about that in our next class session. So I think your brains are probably full with 5 videos, and so that's an introduction to hypothesis testing. And remember, if you didn't catch it all, it's okay, because we are spending a lot of the semester on hypothesis testing, and we'll be able to get you caught up and answer all your questions when I see you at our next class session.